The stethoscope was still around her neck when Amanda Clarke disappeared on October 15th. 1994, in the desert town of Carson Valley, Nevada, population 1,847, Halloween was approaching an autumn chill that would drop temperatures to 34 degrees across Douglas County. At 8:52 p.m., Amanda's roommate, Jessica Martinez, had watched through their dormitory window as a 20-year-old medical student walked across the poorly lit parking lot toward her burgundy Honda Civic after completing her evening shift at Carson Valley Medical Center. Amanda was finishing her second-year rotations in the emergency department, the same white coat and stethoscope that she worn proudly since beginning clinical work 6 months earlier. Jessica observed Amanda's silhouette disappear into the darkness, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, the last image of a promising young doctor whose ambitions would never be realized. What happened in the next 73 minutes would haunt Carson Valley for the next 3 decades. Amanda's boyfriend, David Thompson, called the Douglas County Sheriff's Department at 10:05 p.m., his voice tight with controlled panic, as he reported that Amanda had never arrived at their planned study session. He'd been waiting in the medical library since 9:15. He explained to Deputy Morrison, becoming increasingly concerned when Amanda failed to respond to his pages. Amanda was never late for their Tuesday evening anatomy review sessions, a ritual they'd maintained since their first year together at the University of Nevada Medical School. David had finally driven to her dormitory, where Jessica confirmed that Amanda had left for their meeting nearly 2 hours earlier. The Honda was discovered at 10:37 p.m. by a Nevada Highway Patrol officer conducting routine patrols along State Route 208. The vehicle sat idling on the shoulder 3 miles north of town, its headlights illuminating the desert scrub that stretched endlessly toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. The driver's side door hung open, revealing the interior dome light, casting an eerie glow across the empty seats. Amanda's medical bag remained on the passenger seat, her textbooks and clinical notes scattered across the upholstery, as if she'd been searching for something important. Her white coat lay crumpled on the driver's seat, still warm from her body heat, and her stethoscope dangled from the rearview mirror, swaying gently in the desert breeze. The only evidence of struggle was a single scuff mark in the gravel beside the open door, and her left shoe, a white leather nursing clog, discovered 15 feet away, partially buried beneath a sagebrush that had been disturbed by something or someone. Sheriff Tom Bradley had spent 18 years maintaining law and order in Douglas County's rural communities, dealing primarily with cattle rustling, occasional domestic disturbances, and predictable troubles that came with mining operations and seasonal tourism. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for a missing person case involving a medical student, especially not one that would quickly escalate beyond the capabilities of his department of 6 full-time deputies, covering 738 square miles of desert mountains and scattered ranches. The initial search began within hours of the Honda's discovery. Bradley assembled every available resource in Douglas County, his 5 deputies, the volunteer fire department, and the Civil Air Patrol volunteers, who typically assisted during flash flood emergencies and winter mountain rescues. By midnight on October 16th, nearly 40 people were combing the area around State Route 208, working in systematic grid patterns that Bradley had learned during his military service in Vietnam. The terrain made searching both easier and more challenging than urban investigations. The desert offered clear sightlines for miles during daylight, but the October darkness concealed ravines, arroyos, and abandoned mine shafts where a person could disappear without a trace. The searchers called Amanda's name continuously, their voices carrying across the high desert air, mixing with the sound of coyotes and the distant rumble of freight trains heading toward California. Amanda's parents, Robert and Patricia Clarke, arrived from their home in Reno at 2:30 a.m., having driven through increasingly desolate countryside after receiving Bradley's phone call. Patricia, a registered nurse at Reno General Hospital, immediately began organizing search logistics with the methodical precision she applied to emergency room procedures. Robert, who owned a small accounting practice, approached the crisis with analytical logic, asking about search protocols, communication systems, and statistical probabilities for finding missing persons in desert environments. Neither parent could comprehend how their daughter could simply vanish from a vehicle that showed no signs of mechanical failure or accident. The expanded search began at dawn on October 16th with tracking dogs Borrowed from the Nevada Department of Corrections, the German shepherds picked up Amanda's scent from her dormitory room and followed it to the parking lot, where the trail led directly to where her Honda had been found. But the dogs lost the scent at the roadside, confused by vehicle exhaust, and the dozens of people who had contaminated the scene during the initial investigation. By the third day, Bradley faced pressure from multiple directions. The Reno Gazette-Journal ran front-page stories questioning the department's competence. Parents refused to let their daughters attend evening clinical rotations, and the medical school worried about negative publicity affecting enrollment and funding. Bradley needed a suspect, and he found one in Marcus Webb, Amanda's anatomy lab partner, who had dated her briefly during their first year. Webb became the focus of an investigation driven more by desperation than evidence. His previous relationship with Amanda provided motive. His knowledge of her schedule created opportunity, and his presence at a downtown bar until closing time on October 15th offered an alibi that couldn't be definitively proven. Under intense questioning, Webb's story contained minor inconsistencies that Bradley's inexperienced team interpreted as deception. The fact that Webb had been seen arguing with Amanda outside the medical library in September became central to the prosecution's theory. The arrest came on October 28th, accompanied by local media coverage that presumed guilt. Webb's family hired a public defender from Las Vegas who seemed overwhelmed by the case's complexity and the community's demand for swift justice. The preliminary hearing revealed the weakness of the state's evidence. No physical proof linking Webb to the abandoned vehicle, no witnesses placed him on State Route 208, and nobody who could explain how he might have disposed of Amanda's body in the vast desert wilderness that surrounded Carson Valley. But in a town demanding answers, reasonable doubt felt like an inadequate defense against community outrage. The charges against Webb collapsed in January 1995 when his alibi was corroborated by newly discovered security footage from the Bucket of Blood saloon. But the damage to both Webb and the investigation proved irreversible. Public confidence in the sheriff's department evaporated, and potential witnesses already hesitant to come forward retreated further into silence. Amanda Clarke's case joined the growing stack of unsolved files in Bradley's office, where it would remain untouched for the next 18 years. Patricia Clarke's obsession began with small rituals that seemed reasonable to a grieving mother. She kept Amanda's dormitory room exactly as it had been on October 15th, 1994, making the bed each morning with the same floral bedspread, dusting the collection of medical textbooks on the desk, and ensuring that Amanda's study schedule remained posted on the bulletin board exactly as she had left it. The anatomy notes that Amanda had been reviewing the night before her disappearance stayed open to page 847, her highlighter lying beside the textbook at the exact angle where she had placed it. After marking a passage about cardiac catheterization procedures in the first months after Amanda vanished, this preservation felt like hope. Patricia told herself that Amanda would return to find everything waiting for her, that maintaining normality was a form of faith that would somehow call her daughter home. But as 1994 became 1995, and then 1996, the unchanged room transformed from a shrine of hope into a monument to lost Robert Clarke, began sleeping in the guest room, unable to pass Amanda's door each night, and see Patricia sitting on the edge of the bed holding Amanda's stethoscope and whispering conversations with a daughter who wasn't there to answer. The annual pilgrimage to Sheriff Bradley's office became Patricia's most sacred ritual. Every October 15th, she would dress in her best nursing uniform, drive the 67 miles from Reno to Minden, and file a new missing person report for Amanda Marie Clarke. The law didn't require annual filing for missing persons cases, but Patricia had convinced herself that constant pressure was the only way to prevent Amanda's case from being forgotten. Bradley, and later his successor, Sheriff James Miller, received these visits with patient compassion, even as the reports became increasingly detailed and somewhat detached from reality. By 1999, Patricia's reports included elaborate theories about Amanda's disappearance that she had developed through extensive correspondence with other families of missing children across the Southwest. She became convinced that a network of criminals was systematically abducting medical students from rural areas, transporting them across state lines for purposes she could never articulate, but clearly feared. Her letters to the FBI grew more frequent and more desperate, filled with connections she had drawn between Amanda's case and missing person reports from Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico that shared only the most. Superficial similarities, the psychological toll on the Clarke family, became evident to their Reno community in ways that no one quite knew how to address. Robert Clarke, a man who had been known for his steady reliability and gentle humor, became increasingly withdrawn and began working 16-hour days at his accounting office to avoid going home, where Patricia's investigation materials had taken over every room in their modest ranch house, their marriage, which had been solid and affectionate before. Amanda's disappearance became a careful choreography of two people trying to grieve in the same house without acknowledging that their grief had taken incompatible forms. Patricia's obsession expanded beyond the annual reports to include maintaining detailed correspondence with psychics, private investigators who promised results for money the Clarkes couldn't afford, and amateur detectives who contacted her after reading about Amanda's case in true crime magazines. She converted Amanda's former bedroom into an informal command center covering the walls, with maps marked with pins indicating where other medical students had disappeared, timelines written in her increasingly erratic handwriting, and photographs of men who'd been arrested for similar crimes in other states. The community's initial sympathy gradually gave way to uncomfortable avoidance. Patricia's behavior at hospital staff meetings became unpredictable, sometimes involving tearful outbursts during discussions of patient care and other times manifesting as inappropriate laughter during serious moments. When her mind had wandered to some memory of Amanda, the nursing administration stopped including her in committee assignments, not out of cruelty, but because her presence transformed every meeting into an occasion for discussing theories about Amanda's disappearance that had become increasingly disconnected from evidence or logic. Robert Clarke died of a stroke in 2012, found by Patricia in his home office where he had been working alone on tax returns. The official cause was cerebrovascular accident, but everyone at the hospital understood that Robert had been dying slowly for 18 years, worn down by grief, and Patricia's refusal to accept that Amanda was never coming home. Patricia discovered his body at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 18 years and 4 months after Amanda had failed to arrive at her study session. On another Tuesday evening, Detective Maria Santos discovered the forgotten evidence box on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in August 2018. 24 years after Amanda Clarke's disappearance, Santos had been assigned to conduct an inventory of the Douglas County Courthouse basement storage areas as part of a state mandate to digitize old records and clear space for new electronic filing systems. The basement stretched beneath the entire courthouse, built in a maze of concrete wall rooms that had accumulated decades of legal documents, evidence boxes, and administrative files that no one quite remembered how to categorize properly. The Clarke case file sat in a cardboard storage box that had been misfiled in a section designated for civil court records rather than criminal investigations. The box itself showed signs of rodent damage and desert heat exposure, leaving brown stains along the edges and a musty smell that indicated prolonged storage in less than ideal conditions. Santos nearly overlooked it entirely, mistaking it for another container of property deed transfers or probate documents that filled most of the surrounding shelves. When Santos finally opened the box, she found herself looking at a case that predated her law enforcement career by 8 years. The original evidence inventory typed on yellowed paper with a manual typewriter whose R key struck slightly lower than the other letters listed 43 items collected during the initial investigation. Most were routine materials that had yielded no useful information. Soil samples from the roadside where Amanda's Honda was found, photographs of tire tracks that proved too degraded to match witness statements that had led nowhere productive, but buried beneath layers of routine evidence bags and faded photographs was something that made Santos pause in the stifling basement air. Evidence bag number 12 contained fabric fibers recovered from Amanda's white medical coat, the one she had been wearing when she left the hospital on October 15th. 1994, the coat had been found draped over her car's steering wheel with the fabric separated along a seam in a way that suggested sudden forceful contact rather than gradual, where more importantly the evidence bag also contained several smaller envelopes labeled unknown fiber samples and biological material collected at Scene the Fiber. Samples have been collected by FBI technician Robert Martinez, whose meticulous evidence collection methods have been noted throughout the original case file. Martinez had used tweezers to remove fibers from the torn section of Amanda's coat that appeared inconsistent with the coat's own material composition under the magnification available in 1994. These fibers appear to be synthetic blend fabric in a dark blue or black color, possibly from work clothing or institutional uniforms, but the technology to analyze these samples properly simply hadn't existed when they were collected. Santos found herself staring at evidence that had been waiting nearly a quarter century for forensic science to catch up with. Investigative theory DNA analysis had become standard procedure in criminal investigations by 2018, and the techniques for extracting genetic material from fabric fibers had evolved dramatically. During the previous decade, the Nevada State Crime Laboratory had recently acquired equipment capable of analyzing microscopic biological samples that would have been useless to earlier forensic methods. The fabric fragments told a more complex story. Martinez had collected these pieces from the ground near where Amanda's Honda was discovered, some caught on desert vegetation and others embedded in the gravel shoulder State Route 208. The fragments appear to come from at least 3 different sources. Pieces that matched Amanda's white coat scraps that seemed consistent with medical scrubs, and several pieces that clearly came from different garments. Entirely one fragment, barely larger than a thumbprint, showed what appeared to be a small tear pattern with microscopic traces of what Martinez had described as possible biological material. Santos carefully photographed each piece of evidence before resealing containers. According to updated chain of custody protocols, the basement storage had not been ideal for preserving biological evidence, but the dry desert climate had actually helped prevent the degradation that might have occurred in more humid environments. She could feel the weight of possibility as she carried the box upstairs to her office, understanding that these forgotten fragments might contain the key to answering questions that had tormented the Clarke family for nearly a quarter century. Michael Thompson was 12 years old when Amanda Clarke disappeared, young enough that his memories of his older brother David's girlfriend were filtered through the lens of childhood admiration rather than the complex understanding that comes with adult relationships. By 2019, when Patricia Clarke finally succumbed to complications from diabetes that had gone untreated during years of obsessive focus on Amanda's case, Michael had spent 25 years watching his brother struggle with guilt and unanswered questions that had shaped David's entire medical career. Patricia's death came on a March morning when the Nevada desert was beginning to show the first signs of spring. Michael found her at her kitchen table, where she had been reviewing case files until the early hours, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of 25 years of investigation. The room had evolved from a normal kitchen into something resembling a conspiracy theorist command center, with walls covered in maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten timelines that trace connections between Amanda's disappearance and dozens of other missing person cases across the Southwest. The funeral was well attended by Patricia's former colleagues at Reno General Hospital, who remembered her as a dedicated nurse before tragedy had redefined her existence. Michael stood beside the grave in the Mountain View Cemetery, where Robert Clarke had been buried 7 years earlier, listening to the hospital chaplain deliver a eulogy that struggled to find words for a woman whose life had effectively ended on the same October night that claimed Amanda, the chaplain, spoke about. Patricia's devotion and persistence, carefully avoiding any direct reference to the mental deterioration that had made her final years a source of discomfort for colleagues who had once respected her professional skills. After the funeral, Michael faced the overwhelming task of sorting through Patricia's accumulated materials. The house had become a repository for every document, photograph, and piece of correspondence related to Amanda's case, organized according to a system that made sense only to Patricia's increasingly fragmented thinking. Boxes filled the garage containing copies of police reports, letters to and from FBI agents, communications with psychics and private investigators, and detailed notes about television programs that had featured missing person cases with any superficial similarity to Amanda's disappearance. But buried within Patricia's obsessive documentation, Michael discovered evidence of genuine investigative work that had been dismissed or overlooked by law enforcement. Agencies overwhelmed by her more erratic theories, Patricia had maintained correspondence with families of missing medical students across Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, creating a network of shared information that revealed patterns no single jurisdiction had been able to recognize. Her maps showed clusters of disappearances that occurred during specific time periods in rural areas served by similar highway routes, suggesting the possibility of a mobile perpetrator who had never been identified. Because the crimes crossed multiple jurisdictional boundaries, Michael had inherited his mother's determination, but possessed the emotional stability that 25 years of grief had gradually eroded in Patricia. He approached Amanda's case with a methodical mindset of someone who had spent his career in software development, understanding that solving complex problems required systematic analysis rather than intuitive leaps. He began by digitizing Patricia's entire collection, scanning thousands of documents and photographs into a computer database that would allow him to search for patterns and connections that might have been invisible when scattered across physical files. The breakthrough came when Michael contacted Detective Maria Santos, who had maintained the Clarke case file as an active cold case despite her department's limited resources for investigations that had produced no viable leads in over 2 decades. Santos had kept Amanda's case in her thoughts even after leaving the Douglas County Sheriff's Department for a position with the Nevada State Police, occasionally revisiting the evidence when new forensic techniques became available. When Michael explained his systematic approach to organizing Patricia's research, Santos realized that the combination of Patricia's investigative work and modern DNA analysis might finally provide the answers that had eluded investigators for more than 25 years. Michael's persistence differed from his mother's in crucial ways. Where Patricia had been driven by desperate hope and increasingly irrational theories, Michael was motivated by a desire to honor both Amanda's memory and Patricia's lifelong dedication. He understood that solving Amanda's case wouldn't bring either of them back, but he also recognized that allowing the investigation to die with Patricia would mean that their suffering had served no purpose. Detective Maria Santos received a phone call from the Nevada State Crime Laboratory at 4:23 p.m. on September 12th, 2023, 29 years after Amanda Clarke had failed to arrive at her study session. Santos had been working the Clarke case intermittently for 5 years, ever since Michael Thompson's persistent advocacy had convinced her supervisor to authorize the expensive genetic genealogy analysis that might finally identify the unknown DNA profile extracted from Amanda's torn medical coat. The laboratory technician, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood that her words would reshape decades of unanswered questions. The genetic material recovered from the fabric fragments had yielded a partial but usable DNA profile that had been run through a combined DNA index system with no matches, indicating that Amanda's abductor had never been arrested for a felony crime that required DNA submission or had committed a crime before mandatory DNA collection became standard practice. But the newer technique of forensic genetic genealogy, which compared crime scene DNA to publicly available genetic databases used by ancestry research companies, had produced something unprecedented in the Clarke case, a family tree that led to a specific individual. Santos felt her pulse quicken as Dr. Walsh explained the methodology. The DNA profile had been uploaded to GeneMatch, a public database where people who had taken commercial ancestry tests could share their genetic information to find relatives. The system had identified several distant cousins whose family trees, when analyzed by genetic genealogist Caroline Martinez, converged on a common set of ancestors in Northern California. During the 1800s, Martinez had spent 8 weeks constructing detailed family trees for each branch, working backward through birth records, marriage certificates, and census data to identify living descendants who could have contributed the DNA found on Amanda's coat. The genealogy analysis had narrowed the possibilities to 4 men who would have been between 25 and 45 years old in 1994 and living within 100 miles of Carson Valley. 2 of these men were still alive and had voluntarily provided DNA samples that eliminated them as matches. 1 had died in 2018 before investigators could contact him. 4th was William James Hendricks, who had died of complications from liver disease in 2021 at the age of 67. Hendricks's DNA profile, collected during a 2019 arrest for driving under the influence, had been entered into Cody's posthumously when Nevada expanded its database inclusion criteria in 2022. Santos stared at the case file that Dr. Walsh had transmitted electronically, reading details about a man who had lived his entire life within the geographic area where Amanda Clarke disappeared. William Hendricks had been born in 1954 in nearby Gardnerville, making him 40 years old when Amanda vanished. His criminal record showed a pattern of increasingly serious offenses that began with petty theft charges in his 20s and escalated to assault and domestic violence convictions throughout his adult life. Most significantly, Hendricks had been arrested twice for what the reports termed inappropriate contact with female hospital employees, though both cases had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence and uncooperative witnesses. The address history in Hendricks's file revealed something that made Santos's hand shake slightly as she turned the pages. In October 1994, William Hendricks had been working as a night security guard at Carson Valley Medical Center, the same hospital where Amanda Clarke had completed her clinical rotations, in the same facility from which she had departed on the night she disappeared. The employment record showed that Hendricks had access to all areas of the hospital, including employee parking areas, staff schedules, and personal information about medical students and residents. His position required him to patrol the grounds during evening and overnight hours, giving him detailed knowledge of when students and staff typically arrived and departed. The investigation into William Hendricks's background revealed a pattern of predatory behavior against young women that had been hidden for decades behind the protective silence of small-town employment networks and the limitations of pre-digital record keeping. Santos spent 4 weeks in October 2023 traveling between courthouses, police departments, and newspaper archives across northern Nevada, piecing together a criminal history that no single jurisdiction had been able to see in its entirety. Hendricks's first documented assault against a female occurred in 1995, less than 6 months after Amanda Clarke's disappearance. Lisa Rodriguez, then 22 years old and working as a medical technician at Reno General Hospital, had reported that a man matching Hendricks's description had followed her home from work on multiple occasions before attacking her in the parking garage of her apartment complex. Rodriguez's description of her attacker included specific details about a scar on his right forearm from a childhood accident that matched medical records for William Hendricks, but the investigation had been closed when Rodriguez suddenly moved to California and refused to cooperate further with police. The pattern continued through the 1990s and 2000s with remarkable consistency. Santos discovered reports from Washoe County, Carson County, and Lyon County describing similar incidents. Young women who reported being stalked and attacked by a man who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost in the rural areas between small towns. The attacks typically occurred along isolated highways during evening hours, and the perpetrator invariably fled when victims resisted or when other vehicles approached. Most disturbing was the age range and physical description of the victims. All were between 18 and 25 years old. All had blonde or light brown hair similar to Amanda Clarke's, and all were either medical students or healthcare workers traveling alone when they were targeted. Santos's breakthrough came when she contacted Detective Frank Martinez, whose father had been the FBI technician assigned to Amanda's original case. The younger Martinez had inherited his father's case files when the elder investigator died in 2015 and had maintained them in his home office. As an unofficial cold case archive, among these files was a folder labeled Similar Incidents Potential Connection that contained reports his father had collected but never formally investigated due to jurisdictional limitations and resource constraints. The folder contained detailed notes about William Hendricks that had never been included in the official Clarke case file. FBI agent Robert Martinez had become suspicious of Hendricks in 1996 when a pattern of attacks in northern Nevada led him to re-examine the list of hospital employees who had been questioned during the original investigation. Martinez had conducted unofficial surveillance of Hendricks' activities on several occasions and had documented observations about his behavior that suggested potential involvement in multiple crimes against young women. However, the surveillance had been informal and had never produced evidence sufficient for an arrest warrant The most significant discovery came when Santos obtained permission to search the Hendricks property, which had been inherited by Williams' estranged son Thomas after his death in 2021. Thomas Hendricks, who lived in Sacramento and had been estranged from his father for over 15 years, granted permission for a complete search after learning about the DNA evidence connecting his father to Amanda Clarke's disappearance. He had suspected that his father was capable of violence, having witnessed his brutal treatment of Thomas's mother throughout his childhood, but had never imagined the scope of Williams' crimes. The search of the Hendricks property began on November 15th, 2023, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs that had not been available to investigators in 1994. The main house had been abandoned since Williams' death, but the property yielded evidence that painted a horrifying picture of his activities. Buried beneath what had been a storage shed, searchers discovered a metal footlocker containing items that could only be described as trophies, pieces of clothing, jewelry, and personal items that matched descriptions of belongings taken from multiple victims across several decades. Among these items was a silver bracelet engraved with the initials AMC that matched the description Patricia Clarke had provided to investigators of Amanda's favorite piece of jewelry. The bracelet had been a graduation gift from high school, and Amanda had worn it constantly during her medical school years. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative team and provided Michael Thompson with the first concrete proof that Amanda's case was finally approaching resolution. The evidence against William Hendricks became overwhelming during the winter of 2023, but the finality of his death 2 years earlier meant that traditional justice would never be fully realized. Detective Santos found herself in the peculiar position of building an airtight case against a man who would never stand trial, never face Amanda's family in court, and never be forced to account for the decades of suffering he had inflicted on communities throughout northern Nevada. The forensic analysis of items recovered from Hendricks' property revealed connections to at least 6 other missing person cases spanning from 1993 to 2008. DNA evidence linked Hendricks definitively to 3 of these cases, while personal belongings found in his collection provided circumstantial evidence connecting him to several others. Amanda's bracelet was just one piece in a macabre treasure trove that included a class ring belonging to Maria Santos, who had disappeared from Washoe County in 1997, and a distinctive turquoise necklace that had belonged to Jennifer Walsh, a 19-year-old who vanished while driving home from her job at a Carson City Medical Clinic in 2003. Santos spent countless hours reviewing the original investigation files from these related cases, understanding now why the crimes had never been connected during the years when Hendricks was actively preying on young women. The jurisdictional boundaries that separated Douglas County from Washoe County, Carson County, and Lyon County had created investigative silos that prevented law enforcement agencies from recognizing the pattern of a single predator moving systematically through northern Nevada. Each case had been worked independently by dedicated investigators who lacked the communication networks and database systems that would have revealed the connections between Hendricks' crimes. The most devastating revelation came when Santos discovered how close the original investigation had come to identifying Hendricks as Amanda Clarke's killer. In November 1994, Sheriff Tom Bradley had obtained a warrant to search all Carson Valley Medical Center employee records based on witness reports that placed a hospital security vehicle in the vicinity of State Route 208 during the evening hours when Amanda disappeared. However, the search had been limited to reviewing personnel files rather than conducting physical searches of employee property, and Hendricks had successfully passed a polygraph examination that investigators at the time considered conclusive evidence of his innocence. The polygraph results, combined with his apparently solid alibi of being on duty at the hospital during Amanda's disappearance, had eliminated him as a suspect. After only cursory investigation, Santos learned that Bradley had maintained unofficial interest in Hendricks through the mid-1990s, documenting his movements and noting correlations between Hendricks' work schedule and the timing of attacks on young women in the region. Bradley's personal notes discovered in his son's garage after the former sheriff's death in 2020 revealed a level of suspicion about Hendricks that had never been formally documented due to the limitations of evidence collection and legal procedures available at the time. The case files also revealed the tragic irony that Hendrix's criminal activity had actually escalated after he successfully avoided detection for Amanda's murder. The confidence gained from evading the massive investigation into Amanda's disappearance had apparently convinced Hendrix that he could continue attacking young women without consequences. Subsequent victims had paid the price for the investigative limitations that had allowed him to remain free after killing Amanda Clarke. By December 2023, Santos had assembled sufficient evidence to close 7 separate cases that had remained unsolved for decades. The Nevada Attorney General formally declared that William Hendrix would have been charged with first-degree murder in Amanda Clarke's death if he had been alive to face prosecution. Similar declarations were issued by prosecutors in the 3 other counties where Hendrix's crimes had occurred, providing official recognition of his guilt even though traditional justice was impossible. Michael Thompson received a call from Detective Santos on December 18, 2023, exactly 29 years and 2 months after his 12-year-old world had been shattered by Amanda's disappearance. He was working in his home office in San Francisco, reviewing software development projects for the upcoming quarter, when his cell phone rang with the news that would finally close the longest chapter of his family's tormented history. Santos's voice carried the weight of both triumph and tragedy as she explained that the Nevada State Police had officially closed Amanda Marie Clarke's missing person case. The DNA evidence, combined with the discovery of Amanda's bracelet among Hendrix's hidden collection, provided conclusive proof that William Hendrix had abducted and murdered Amanda on October 15th. 1994. Santos spoke carefully, understanding that the words she was choosing would become Michael's permanent memory of the moment. When 29 years of questions finally received their answers, the news brought Michael a complex mixture of relief, grief, and anger that he struggled to process. Relief that the uncertainty was finally over, that Patricia's lifelong obsession had been vindicated, and that Amanda's memory could be honored with truth rather than speculation. Grief for the young woman he had never really known, but whose absence had defined his family's existence. Anger at the decades of suffering that could have been prevented if the original investigation had been able to connect the evidence that ultimately solved the case. Santos arranged for Michael to view the evidence that had been recovered from Hendrix's property, understanding that seeing Amanda's bracelet would provide a tangible connection to her memory that had been missing for nearly 3 decades. Of viewing took place in a conference room at the Nevada State Police headquarters in Carson City, where Michael sat across from Detective Santos and carefully examined the silver bracelet that had once adorned his brother's girlfriend's wrist. The engraving AMC was still clearly visible despite its years of burial, and Michael could imagine Amanda wearing it during the medical school study sessions that David had described so often during their childhood. The formal closure of Amanda's case allowed Michael to finally make arrangements for a memorial service that had been impossible while her fate remained unknown. The service was held at the Carson Valley Medical Center Chapel on January 20th, 2024, exactly 29 years and 3 months after Amanda's disappearance. The small sanctuary was filled with people who had known the Clarke family, participated in the original search efforts, or simply wanted to honor the memory of a young woman whose story had become part of their community's history. Michael spoke during the service about the importance of persistence and the power of modern forensic science to provide answers to questions that had seemed forever unanswerable. He thanked Detective Santos, the Nevada State Police, and the community members who had never stopped caring about Amanda's case. Most importantly, he announced the establishment of the Amanda Clarke Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons in rural communities and advocating for improved communication between law enforcement jurisdictions. The foundation would use donations from David Thompson's successful medical practice to fund training programs for rural law enforcement agencies, providing them with access to modern forensic techniques and interjurisdictional communication systems that could prevent future cases from remaining unsolved for decades. Michael understood that he couldn't bring Amanda back, but he could ensure that her death would contribute to solving other families' mysteries and preventing other communities from experiencing the prolonged suffering that had defined the Thompson and Clarke families' existence. As Michael stood beside Amanda's memorial marker in the Carson Valley Cemetery, where it was placed near the graves of Robert and Patricia Clarke. He felt the weight of 3 decades of uncertainty finally lifting from his shoulders. The questions that had consumed Patricia's life and shadowed his own existence had been answered. Amanda could finally rest in peace, and her family's long vigil was over.